We are officially past the halfway point of the NFL season, which means our fantasy playoffs are just around the corner. And if you're looking to make some moves to help reinforce your roster, then this video is going to be exactly what you need. Because before you make those moves, you probably want to have a pretty good idea of what the remaining schedule will look like for specific players. So I'm going to go through the remaining schedules for quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends to see who has the easiest remaining schedule and who has the worst remaining schedule. Yo, what is going on, Headliner Nation? I've done all of the research for you. I've gone over the remaining NFL schedule for all four main positions to try and figure out who is going to have the easiest and the hardest schedules to finish the year. So if you're looking to make a trade right now, you know who you should be targeting or trying to trade away. Now, there are a couple of points that I need to make before we jump into the information. And number one is going to be, this is not the end-all, be-all Bible of making trades for your teams right now, because there's still going to be a lot to take into consideration when making a trade. What your team currently looks like, what positions you're strong and weak at, any type of trade partner you might be trying to work with, and of course your league and scoring settings. So just because the graphic on the screen might say, hey, this team has the easiest into the year at this position, doesn't necessarily mean that you should just automatically go trade for those guys. But this is more along the lines of giving you an idea of who you could target if you are looking to make certain deals. And number two, what I've done is I have taken the last 4 weeks of fantasy points against for each position to determine what the strength of schedule will look like the rest of the year. So to make sure you understand, I'm not using fantasy points against for the entire season. I'm only using the last 4 weeks. And the reason I did that was to try and make sure that we are ahead of any potential trends that may be currently happening. For instance, just because a team started off playing really well doesn't mean that they may not have had a few injuries, and doesn't mean that they may not be playing a little worse right now, and we should probably take that into consideration. But maybe a team started off playing poorly, but since then they've gotten healthy, they've maybe changed a little bit of what they are doing, or just gotten stronger on that side of the ball, and because of that, it's a much tougher matchup now than maybe it was in week 1, 2, or 3. So again, just to reiterate, the information that you're going to see in this video is based off the last 4 weeks of performances, not the entire season. So if there is a team that maybe had a little bit of an easier matchup over the last couple of weeks, and you're thinking to yourself, I don't really love that that's being included, then maybe go to the big picture and take a look at everything to determine if you still think that is a trade that you want to make. But let's go ahead and hop into quarterbacks first, especially for any of you that might be looking at streaming options. This could really be important. All right, so the teams with the best finishes right now are going to be Carolina, Dallas, and Minnesota. And based off the information that we see right here, Dallas is the only team with a legit fantasy starter as of right now with Dak Prescott. With Carolina, though, maybe Bryce Young is a guy that we could potentially stream. And then for Minnesota, based on how Josh Dobbs played this past week, maybe he's a guy in Superflex or 2 quarterback leagues we could use as our quarterback 2 the rest of the way. But starting with Carolina, when you look at what they have to end the season, Carolina's got some decent matchups going up against Atlanta, Jacksonville, and Tampa Bay, who are all ranked in between 17th and 24th of fantasy points allowed to the position. And then Green Bay, who's ranked anywhere from 25th to 32nd, the most fantasy points allowed to the position. So even though there is a few tough matchups from week 11 through week 14, at the end of the season when we're heading into the playoffs, it's looking a lot better for them. When you take a look at Dallas's schedule, every other week from week 12 on, they face a team that is in the bottom 8 of most fantasy points allowed to the position, which is absolutely excellent to see if you've been rolling with Dak Prescott so far this year. And yeah, they're going to get sandwiched in between like a Seattle, who ranks in between 9 and 16, and then a Buffalo team that is in the top 8th of fewest fantasy points allowed. But going every other week against such a good offensive matchup, you definitely will be wanting to roll Dak Prescott out at the end of the year. Now, Minnesota is going to have tough matchups in week 14 and 15, and you're going to take a look at Las Vegas and say, how are they ranked there right now? And it's because so many teams run against them. But I think this past week, you could see that defense playing a little bit better. even though it was the New York Giants. But those two matchups are going to be sandwiched in between a lot of really good matchups. Denver, Chicago, and Green Bay are all going to be in green. And then in week 16 and 18, they're going to have Detroit as well. Detroit right now going up against quarterbacks, not awful, but they do allow a few fantasy points, especially if they put teams in negative game script. So if Josh Dobbs is going to be the starter the rest of the year, maybe in a one quarterback league, you're not interested in him, but in a 2 QB or super flex league, he could be a decent QB too. All right, now what about the teams with the worst finishes right now? And we have got Cincinnati that's going to have a decent stretch weeks 13, 14, and 15, but they're facing top 8 teams in fantasy points allowed to the quarterback positions in week 11, 12, 16, 17, and 18. If you have Joe Burrow, I'm not saying run out and trade him, but I wouldn't expect crazy numbers to end the year. CJ Stroud has absolutely been killing it, but when you take a look at his stretch from weeks 14 through week 17, right when you're heading into the fantasy playoffs, if you've been rolling with CJ Stroud, he's also going to have kind of a rough patch right there when you head right into the playoffs. So if you are a playoff team, I would definitely consider having a backup quarterback with an easier schedule on your bench just in case. From week 10 through week 18, Jacksonville is now going to face a team that ranks in the top 16 of fewest fantasy points allowed to the quarterback position every single game, but 2 of them. They do not have a bottom 8 team for the rest of the season. So just like Joe Burrow, when you take a look at Trevor Lawrence, we know he's really talented, but make sure that you potentially have a backup quarterback, especially for those Cleveland and Baltimore matchups. Now, we clearly won't be sitting Patrick Mahomes, but by looking at the schedule, we know that the fantasy playoffs could bring a lower ceiling for him. Now, in this instance, are you going to be sitting Patrick Mahomes during this time? No. Do you need to carry a different quarterback? No. Do you need to trade Patrick Mahomes for a different quarterback? No. If a trade does organically happen where maybe you can get somebody with a little bit better schedule that has just as much upside, then maybe it happens. But in this instance, really what you got to do is you got to roll with Patrick Mahomes, and hopefully this offense just plays a little bit better at the end of the year. In week 13, Tua's going to get Washington, who's currently in the bottom 8 of most fantasy points allowed to the quarterback position. But outside of that, every matchup the rest of the year is going to be a tough one, especially with Dallas, Baltimore, and Buffalo to end the season in week 16, 17, and 18, all of which are in the top 8 fewest fantasy points allowed to quarterback. Kenny Pickett's going to get a decent matchup in week 10 against Green Bay, and then he's going to get a decent matchup in week 13 against Arizona. But outside an okay matchup in week 15 against Indianapolis, he's going to have some really tough opponents. And given how inconsistent that offense has been, we're probably not going to be looking to start him down the stretch. Sam Howell's going to get a good matchup in week 13 against Miami. Then he's going to have the bye. Then he's going to get a good matchup against the LA Rams in week 15. But in between those, he's going to have Seattle, the New York Giants, and Dallas. Then after that, he's going to have the New York Jets, San Francisco, and Dallas again. All of these matchups are going to be extremely tough. So while we might be holding on to Sam Howell for those Miami and Rams matchups, definitely be looking ahead for that Dallas matchup on both occasions and San Francisco. Then, of course, the New York Jets in week 16. All right, at the running back position, I definitely tried to expand a little bit more for you since really a lot of people are going to be looking at running backs and wide receivers in this video for the most part. So when you take a look at the running back position, Houston doesn't have a bad finish to the season. Houston right now is going to have games every single week the rest of the year with a team that ranks 17th or lower right now against the run. And because of that, we are definitely finding ourselves in a situation where Devin Singletary, who might be the starter moving forward, could be a guy that we could flex the rest of the season. Now, it also is going to depend on the health of Dameon Pierce, and you're not going to be trading for Devin Singletary either, but if he's still available on your waiver wire, I would go ahead and grab him up right now. Now, for Kansas City, Isaiah Pacheco has been a really decent floor running back for us, but we've seen a lot of issues with him reaching his upside and a lot of really good matchups. But he is going to face bottom 8 teams against the run in both week 12, 14, 15, 16, and 17. He has got a really nice stretch of games from 14 through 17, which will be just on the outside heading into and finishing for a majority of your playoffs. Isaiah Pacheco was a guy that I was buying a few weeks ago. If you haven't bought him yet, I would definitely be looking at him now. The Chargers are going to get Detroit and Green Bay in weeks 10 and 11, and then Kansas City in week 18. But in between those matchups, they're going to have some really decent opponents, especially New England, Las Vegas, and Buffalo in weeks 13, 15, and 16. So for Austin Eckler, that could be a great opportunity. For those that are worried about his work on the ground right now, that could definitely be an opportunity where after Detroit and Green Bay, we could potentially buy a little bit low on him and get some really good matchups. Raheem Mostert and Devon Achane are both going to have some really great matchups the rest of the season. They're going to be on the bye in week 10, and then in week 13, they're going to have Washington, but everywhere else, they have got very good matchups, especially Las Vegas, the New York Jets twice, Dallas, and Buffalo. Make sure that if you have either of these guys, that you are holding on to them, because there is definitely a possibility, given how tough the matchups could be for Tua during that stretch, that they could run the ball a little bit more successfully. Najee Harris and Jaylen Warren don't have great matchups in week 17, which for a majority of you will probably be your championship weeks. But in weeks 12, 14, 15, and 16, they definitely could offer us enough potential to help get us into the fantasy playoffs and then get us into our fantasy championship. All right, now for worst finishes, when you take a look at the way James Conner's schedule is going to line up for Arizona when he comes back from injury, it's not looking good. We have got matchups that range anywhere from 1 to 16 against the run right now, and in weeks 15, 16, and 17 against San Francisco, Chicago, and then Philadelphia, James Conner owners are going to find yourself in a really harsh position where there's not a whole lot of ceiling. For the New York Giants and Saquon Barkley, you're going to find yourself in a tough position in weeks 14, 15, 16, and 17, and then even if you have to play a championship in week 18. Now, the one thing about Saquon Barkley right now is he's getting a ton of work, especially hearing that Daniel Jones likely has an ACL tear now, and we don't know what the quarterback position is going to look like for New York moving forward. Saquon Barkley is getting so much volume right now that you're not going to want to trade him for just pennies on the dollar, because based on his volume alone, he could still offer you a pretty decent floor even in these tougher matchups. And given the fact that he still gets targets in the passing game, that's also going to help prop up his floor as well. So if you look at these matchups and you say to yourself, man, I've got to get rid of Saquon Barkley, I don't love the way his schedule looks to end the season, be very careful what you trade him for, because you should absolutely be getting a top tier running back in return and multiple pieces. Right now, I'm not even 100% sure what to make out of the Carolina backfield. Since Chuba Hubbard started seeing a large increase in his workload, he hasn't really been super efficient, but he's getting a decent amount of touches, and you still have Miles Sanders there sniping some of those touches from him. So when you take a look at Carolina's schedules from week 13 through week 16 and seeing those tough matchups, it's really hard for me to want to bank on either of those guys. If you have Chuba Hubbard right now and you want to maybe package him along with a wide receiver to upgrade at the wide receiver position, that would probably be your best bet, especially if Chuba isn't really a starter for you and you would be willing to trade him, because a fantasy owner out there who's looking for a running back may be willing to bite, not knowing the upcoming schedule. So whoever the Chicago running back is going to be in a few weeks, whether it's Khalil Herbert when he comes back, whether it continues to be Dante Foreman, if Roshan Johnson gets an increase in a workload, whatever it may be, going up against Carolina in week 10 may not be that bad. And Cleveland and Arizona in week 15 and 16 could end up helping out as well. Again, over the last 4 weeks, Cleveland has allowed a little bit more to the running back position than what we had seen at the beginning of the year. But tough matchups, going up against Detroit twice in weeks 11 and 14, Minnesota in week 12, and then Atlanta and Green Bay to end the season. If you're trying to utilize any of these guys, just like I mentioned with Chuba Hubbard, maybe they're guys that you could utilize in a trade to upgrade elsewhere right now. Man, Tony Pollard has been struggling this year, and he hasn't done a whole lot for you. And while he might be able to help you out the next couple of weeks in weeks 10 and 11 against the Giants in Carolina, when you look at weeks 12, 13, 14, 16, and 17, and then possibly even week 18 as well, things are not going to get better for Tony Pollard. And a few weeks ago, I already listed him as a trade candidate. And this schedule now reinforces the fact that we should be looking to move him. If I were you and I owned Tony Pollard, I would probably hold off and keep him for week 10 and 11. Hopefully he busts out and then try to trade him at that point for another running back or possibly an upgrade elsewhere and getting a running back in return. For Breece Hall and the New York Jets, weeks 10 and 11 could end up working out really well for you. And then if your fantasy championship is in week 18, that might not be bad either. But you've got Miami, Atlanta, Houston, Miami again, and Washington, all from weeks 12 through 16. Now, the one thing I will say for Breece Hall is that because he helps so much in the passing game, he's very similar to Saquon Barkley. Yeah, when you take a look at the schedule, it's not that great. But because he gets a lot of volume, which he does now, and because he's utilized in the passing game, his floor actually comes a lot higher than some of these other guys that have a really tough end of season schedule. So for Breece Hall, it's just like Barkley. I'm not really actively looking to trade him right now, unless I'm maybe putting another piece together to get a huge upgrade at the running back position. Or in this instance right now with him, I just keep him. I let it play out. Hopefully he gets enough work in the passing game, breaks off a huge play here or there, and we're just fine the rest of the season, and he leads us to a fantasy championship. All right, let's go ahead and move on over to the wide receiver position. And because there's so many wide receivers to choose from, whether teams are starting 3 wide receivers or flexing them, I definitely wanted to make sure that I tried to include a few more teams in this portion of the video. For Arizona, we're really keying on weeks 15, 16, and 17, right in the heart of the fantasy playoffs, because you're going to have 2 bottom 8 matchups against San Francisco and Philadelphia, and then a 17 to 24 matchup with Chicago in that area as well. This will be the perfect time for Marquise Brown to help you out and hopefully have a decent ceiling to get that fantasy championship for you. For Baltimore and Zay Flowers, you've got the Rams and Miami in weeks 14 and 17, and then bottom 8 matchups with Jacksonville and San Francisco in weeks 15 and 16. There's definitely going to be a good high ceiling chance here for Zay Flowers going up against teams like Jacksonville, San Francisco, and Miami, given the fact that we're probably going to see quite a bit of a shootout in these games. For Carolina, we're really only considering Adam Thielen at this point, but in weeks 15 and 16, you against Atlanta and Green Bay, and then Jacksonville and Tampa Bay to end the season if you end up playing into week 18. Now, Carolina's schedule before that could end up looking pretty rough, and Thielen could see a little bit of a dip, but if you own him right now, I definitely wouldn't get rid of him, and I would make sure I'm holding on to him for the fantasy playoffs. Really the same thing here for DJ Moore. Tough matchups potentially with Detroit, Minnesota, and then Detroit again after the bye. But then you're going to get Cleveland, Arizona, and Atlanta, who have all struggled recently against the pass, and that's going to be at the very end of the season, right in the heart of the fantasy playoffs. That is when you're going to want DJ Moore, especially if you own him as like your wide receiver 2. He could give you some really good wide receiver 2 floor with a little bit of upside to go with it. New Orleans is going to have some good matchups to end the season. Mike Thomas, Chris Olave, Rashid Shaheed from weeks 14 through 18 is definitely going to have an opportunity to hit their upside every single week. They'll also have Atlanta in week 12 with 2 tougher matchups in week 10 and 13. So to end the season, Chris Olave, hopefully you've been holding on to him. If you're a member, I did a film breakdown of him the other day. I told you not to panic. He scored a touchdown this past week, and we're going to keep our fingers crossed to end the season. He does some big things as well. Now, the New York Giants might have a decent end to the season, but you're not really trading for any wide receivers, considering a majority of them are probably even on waivers right now. A really tough matchup with New Orleans in week 15, and then Dallas this coming week in week 10. But outside of that, not a bad finish to the season for their offense. But we don't even know who the quarterback is going to be. If it ends up being Tyrod Taylor, if he can come back and be healthy and help lead this team the rest of the season, then I could give a guy like Wan'Dale Robinson a really, really good shot to hit a decent floor the rest of the year. But that's really going to depend on if he can get back or not. Now, Taylor was placed on injured reserve before week 9, which means that he could actually return to practice during the bye week and then come back and potentially against Green Bay in week 14, which would be perfect heading into the fantasy playoffs for the New York Giants. So we might have to try and figure out weeks 11 and 12. It might not be worth the shot at that time, depending on who the quarterback is. But if Taylor can get back by week 14, we could definitely be cooking at that point. If you've held on to Garrett Wilson this entire season, hopefully to end the year here, you see why we didn't want to get rid of him. Good matchups in weeks 11, 12, 13, and 15, and then really good matchups in week 16 against Washington, and then potentially week 17 against Cleveland, depending on how their defense is playing at that time. When you take a look at Garrett Wilson, maybe he doesn't have the biggest ceiling in the world because Zach Wilson doesn't have the biggest ceiling in the world, but Wilson has played a little bit better as of recent. And because of that, it could definitely get Garrett Wilson into an area where we can at least start him and not feel ridiculous every time. Dallas and Seattle in week 14 and 15 for A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith could end up being tough, but Devontae Smith and A.J. Brown did just fine against Dallas this past week. But then you're going to have the New York Giants in Arizona in week 16 and 17 to end the season. A.J. Brown is going to win us some fantasy championships, baby. You should have him on your roster, and you know what? Even if Devontae Smith is going to be inconsistent the rest of the season, we're going to hold on to him specifically for week 16 and 17. I already mentioned in the quarterback portion that Cincinnati was going to have a tough end of year schedule, and that's going to go ahead and roll right on over here to the wide receivers as well. A tough matchup in week 14 against Indianapolis, and then also tough games in 15, 16, and 17 as well. And again, these stats are based off the last 4 weeks. So if these trends continue, then we absolutely could possibly see a tough matchup against Minnesota in week 15 if they're still playing well. But if they kind of revert back to where they were at the beginning of the season, then obviously it would get a lot easier for Joe Burrow and these wide receivers. But Pittsburgh and Kansas City would be no cakewalk either. Denver is already a team that we're really not looking to start if we have to. And when you take a look at Jerry Jeudy and Cortland Sutton, when we go weeks 13, 14, 15, and 17, they're probably not going to find our lineups too much at that point anyway. For Amon-Ra St. Brown, we're definitely not going to get rid of him because he gets such a high target share. We don't want to move on from him at this point and potentially lose out on that target share. Maybe he misses out on his ceiling against New Orleans, against Denver, who has played a lot better against wide receivers as of late, and then against Dallas in week 17 as well. Even if we do lose a little bit of upside there, there's still some okay matchups with Chicago, Green Bay, and then Chicago again mixed in with that. The fantasy playoffs might not be the best time for him to reach wide receiver 1 status, but given the amount of targets he gets, wide receiver 2 is definitely still in play. In week 16, Indianapolis, Michael Pittman, Josh Downs, they're going to have a decent matchup going up against Atlanta. But week 13, 14, 15, and 17 are not going to be super easy for them at that point. Keep an eye on those matchups and how some things happen over the next couple of weeks. If Las Vegas continues to play well against the pass, even though realistically it's because people run the ball so much, then in week 17, that matchup could get a little bit easier for them. But leading into the playoffs, it's not going to be the best for Pittman or Down. I know a lot of people are hoping that Devontae Adams can get going here very soon, but week 10 against the New York Jets, Kansas City in week 12, weeks 14, 15, and 16 against teams ranked 9 to 16, weeks 17 and 18 against top 8 teams. This is going to be a really tough stretch for Devontae Adams the rest of the way. For those of you relying on Jacoby Myers, he could still see plenty amount of targets because they just continue to pepper him with those targets in this offense, but the ceiling for both of these guys is not going to be what we would like. The finish of the season for the LA Chargers will really depend on Denver and Las Vegas. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I'm taking the last 4 weeks of data to put together these schedules. And Denver and Las Vegas are one of the top teams in terms of fantasy points allowed to the wide receiver position. But we know that they could absolutely get smashed the way they did at the beginning of the year. So when you take a look at Keenan Allen, do I want to give up on him just because I see these matchups in red? Absolutely not. If I own Keenan Allen, I'm just going to be begging for the fact that Denver can't figure it out anymore and Las Vegas's defense just isn't better in the second half than it was in the first half. We'll have to keep an eye on Quentin Johnston as well, given the fact that Josh Palmer just went to the IR, and they're also missing Mike Williams. Jalen Guyton was elevated, but the main person here will definitely be Keenan Allen. Now, we know that Tyreek Hill can absolutely beat anybody, and we're not going to sit Tyreek Hill against anybody, but it is interesting to see how tough the end of the season could be for the Miami Dolphins, especially given the fact that they're on a skid right now. This bye week couldn't come at a better time for them. We'll have to see how they do coming out of the bye. They're going to get rested up, and they're probably going to look better going up against Las Vegas, but then they're going to have two tough matchups against the New York Jets. They're going to have the Dallas Cowboys, and they're going to have the Baltimore Ravens as well to end the season. Tyreek Hill will be a smash start no matter what. Jalen Waddle would be the one that I would be worried about losing his ceiling. Now, using Diontae Johnson to get yourself to the fantasy playoffs would be great. Now, if they would start using George Pickens more often, we could talk about him as well. But I think really the main person right now to discuss would be Diontae Johnson, because over the next few weeks, he does have some better matchups. Cincinnati would be a little bit tough, but then to end the year, Indianapolis, Cincinnati, Seattle, and then Baltimore, if you play in week 18, definitely could hamper the upside for Diontae Johnson. All right, let's wrap things up with the tight end position. And there are three guys specifically that we're going to talk about that could really be great assets to our teams at one of the worst positions to figure out this year. And for Buffalo, Dalton Kincaid could be a great finish to the season, especially given the fact how good he has looked with no Dawson Knox. Now, if Knox comes back, that could hamper that a little bit. He's got a really tough stretch from weeks 11 through 14, but then in the fantasy playoffs for weeks 15, 16, 17, and maybe even 18, he's going to have some high upside matchups for you to help win those leagues. David Njoku is getting going at the right time, and look at that. Even with Deshaun Watson this past week, they still got him going in this offense, which is something that we have not seen with Watson in the past. But his matchups from week 12 through week 16 are absolutely golden and have a lot of upside. Now, Denver has a pretty good end of the season schedule, but honestly, I really don't know what to tell you here because Denver doesn't utilize their tight ends anyway. So, I mean, who knows what could happen? Maybe we need to address it in the next couple of weeks in the tight end rankings or tight end start and sit videos. But I can tell you right now, there's a really good chance that there's no way we're playing any Denver tight end, regardless of how good the schedule is to end the season. All right, for those of you that are loving Sam Laporta, the Detroit Lions do not face a team in the top 8 against tight ends the rest of the season. Green Bay and New Orleans will be their toughest matchups, but outside of that, they face bottom 8 teams in weeks 10, 11, 14, 15, and 17, and then they've got Minnesota in week 16 and 18 as well. Holy cow, Sam Laporta could absolutely light up our fantasy scoreboards the rest of the year. Cole Kmet coming off a really, really good game, but unfortunately the end of his season schedule is not going to look great, especially with Cleveland, Arizona, Atlanta, and Green Bay the last 4 weeks. All of them in the top 8 of fewest fantasy points allowed to the position. Dalton Schultz bounced back in a huge way this week, but he's got the New York Jets, Tennessee, Cleveland, and then Tennessee again, all top 8 and fewest fantasy points allowed from weeks 14 through 17. I would be okay using Dalton Schultz up into that point, but make sure that you have another option going into the playoffs if he's your tight end 1. For the New York Giants, they have a tough end of season schedule, but their starting quarterback may be done for the year. Darren Waller right now is currently on IR. Daniel Bellinger was a guy that I said to maybe take a look at this week if you were desperate for options, but from weeks 14 through 17, given these matchups, I don't want anything to do with Giant tight end. Dallas Goedert ended up leaving the game on Sunday evening. Not really sure what his injury diagnosis is as of yet. A tough matchup in week 15 against Seattle, and then tough matchups in week 16, 17, and 18 could definitely cause problems at the end of the season for him. Seattle isn't really utilizing any of their tight ends that much right now either, so to take a look at this schedule and see how tough it is in the fantasy playoffs just reaffirms the fact that we're not really going to have to worry about them anyway. Tampa Bay's got tough matchups in week 10 and 11, a better matchup in week 12, and then difficult matchups the rest of the way. Cade Otton had a big game this past week. He's playing more offensive snaps than any tight end in football right now, but unfortunately, he's probably not going to be a guy the rest of the season. Well, there you have it, Headliner Nation. You've been asking for another trade video, and I wanted to make sure that we got one done as quickly as possible because trade deadlines are probably coming up very soon for your leagues. I did a running back trade video probably 3 weeks ago, maybe 4 weeks ago now, targeting several guys, and it was really cool to see that those guys that we were talking about then are still the same guys that we're really talking about right now in this video. But make sure that you utilize this video as I discussed at the beginning of it. This is not the end-all be-all Bible. Don't just listen and follow this blindly. You got to make sure that you're still making the best moves for your team by using the information provided in this video to help supplement that. And of course, if you've got trade questions, leave them in the comments down below and I'll try to answer as many of them as I possibly can. But if you say, hey, I have Tony Pollard, who should I trade him for? I'm not going to respond because I can't tell you. If you've got specific trade scenarios, I absolutely could help you out with that though. So leave those in the comments down below. If you're new here to the Headliner, subscribe to the channel. Make sure you all have your bell notifications on though. So anytime we drop a video or go live, you're going to know about it and you can hop right into the action. But for now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to get out of here. Peace out, stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll catch you all on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.